Well, welcome everyone. Hello, I'm Annalise Riles. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwestern Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs and Associate Provost for Global Affairs at Northwestern University, which serves as the Secretariat for the U7+ Alliance of Global Universities. And on behalf of the U7+ Alliance, I would like to welcome you to today's panel on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Recently, over 20 university presidents from the U7+ Alliance signed a joint statement expressing their solidarity with Ukraine and with all those affected by the violence perpetrated by the Russian government. The statement also condemns the bravery and sacrifice of some within Russia who are speaking out against the war. As an alliance, we view this illegal and unjust invasion as an attack also on our core values of peace, truth, democracy, academic freedom, and international cooperation. In response, the presidential statement commits to mobilizing support for the victims of this invasion within our own campuses and beyond, and also to preparing the way to support our colleagues in Ukraine as they rebuild. As an alliance of universities, we're fortunate to be the intellectual home to many of the brightest minds on this conflict, from political science to history to cybersecurity to medicine to law. And today, the U7+ Executive Committee, under the leadership of its chair, Sciences Po, is marshaling our intellectual resources to respond to this conflict in one powerful and meaningful way, with facts and ideas. So we're happy to be joined here today by leading intellectuals from across the U7+ Alliance around the world. And we're especially honored to be joined by a special guest from the Kyiv School of Economics, president of the Kyiv School of Economics in Ukraine, President Timofey Milavonov. So joining us today, we have President Timofey Milavonov, who is president of the Kyiv School of Economics. He's also a former minister of economics and advisor to the current presidential administration of President Zelensky. We also have with us Dominique Arel, who is professor of political science and chair of Ukrainian studies at University of Ottawa. Jutta Brunet, who is Dean and University Professor, and James Marshall Torres Dean's Chair at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Sabine Carey, who is Chair of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Mannheim. Magdala Debinska, Professor of Political Science and Academic Director of the Center for International Studies at Université de Montréal. Thomas Lindemann, Professor of Political Science and Geopolitics at École Polytechnique. Motohiro Tsuchiya, who is Vice President for International Collaboration and Vice President for Global Engagement and Information Technology at Keio University, and also Professor at Keio University's Graduate School of Media and Governance. And Gail Woloshock, who is Professor in the Feinberg School of Medicine's Departments of Radiation, Oncology, Radiology, and Cell and Molecular Biology, and also Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Northwestern University. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for your time. So to our audience today, we will reserve some time for questions at the end of very short comments from each of our panelists. And in the meantime, I encourage you to submit any questions you have throughout the program via the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please note the name of the speaker to whom the question is addressed. So Timofey, let's begin with you. So you are an economist and an expert in government economics. Talk to us, first of all, about the sanctions that we are seeing so far. How effective are these sanctions, and what further sanctions might be needed in response to the terrible events that have been discovered in the last few days?
Thank you. My apologies that I don't have the bandwidth to have a video on. I'm talking from Ukraine, so that's a little bit challenging at times. Sanctions, one way to think about them is to split them in two groups. One is a conventional approach to sanctions. The other one is high precision sanctions. Like weapons in some ways, you can think about this. The conventional sanctions would be what we read in the news. For example, a freeze or restriction on the assets of the Central Bank of Russia. And they have working to an extent, but in economics, at least during the war, it's the difference between inflows and outflows which matters. And as long as Russia continues to sell oil and gas, it will stay positive, net positive. So it's not gonna be hurting it that much because they will continue to earn overall. And currently their revenues, even with de facto sanctions where Russia has become toxic and some countries are not buying oil anymore from Russia, but others do, and gas continues to flow to Europe. So, the minimum they get a day is at least $300 million. And, think of what the needs of Ukraine are, or the amount of cost, that Ukraine and Russia are spending on war. It's, for $9 or $10 billion, you can support the entire Ukraine for a month. So Russia is really having much more than it needs to support the war. Gas and oil have to be embargoed. I know it's costly. Everyone is talking about this, but Ukraine and many other countries had this subsidized, had oil and gas subsidized for many years, and relied on it, and eventually had to cut off completely. And Europe will have to do it too. And sooner it does it, better it is for humanity. The high precision sanctions are about targeting critical supplies which are needed for the military to operate. For example, Bosch equipment which is needed for heating in tanks, or some of the French companies providing electronics which is needed for high precision guidance for missiles. And unfortunately, some of these goods are still flowing into Russia, and it's a little bit of an arms race, cat and mouse game, where they find ways to procure that, and Ukraine and the rest of the world find ways to stop it, and then every day it's another day, it's another battle. So these two types of sanctions, and unfortunately, it's like in any war, it's going to be a daily operation, continuing until the war is over.
Thank you for that. Now, you're an economist and an expert in these particular issues, but you're also running a university in the middle of this conflict. And let me just say on behalf of all of us, what an honor it is to be with you today, and how inspiring the work that you're continuing to do is. And I wonder if you could just say a few words about how the university is continuing at this moment, and what you see the role of KSC, and indeed of Ukrainian universities, in this conflict to be.
One is to demonstrate resilience. The second one is to come up with new innovative way to address the challenges, especially in human capital, which are facing a country in a crisis like this, in a war like this. The way the international help or cooperation is set up is human to human. So, universities come out and say, well, we're going to accept a couple of students, or we'll open a couple of positions. People will say, we'll accept a couple of families. And governments will say, we'll send a little bit of money for these immediate purposes. This is really helpful in the beginning of the conflict, of the war, at the immediate, when there's immediate need. But, we need to also think about how we can have sustainable solutions and institutionalized solutions. So that's what the Kyiv School of Economics is doing. First, it leads by an example, and we restarted bachelor programs on March 16th, which is, the war started on February 24th. So 2.5 weeks into the war, our bachelor programs were up and running. Our master programs are running now, started recently. So, and we're going to have an admission this year, and we're going to operate. Maybe we'll come back to Kyiv soon for full scale operations. Our building, we don't want to jinx it, but, our facilities for now are in decent shape. It's not in an ideal shape, but they are fixable quite quickly, Tony. Then we also have a charitable foundation activities, and I ask everyone to, I have it in my Twitter. I have a tweet pinned, and maybe if you can donate, that would be great. We are trying to send medical supplies, specific ones which are needed, medical kits, to the front lines. And in Ukraine, most people now die, at least on the front lines, from blood loss. And so we need very specific medical kits that ensure that people can self-apply specific, there are tourniquets, there are chemical solutions which will stop the blood loss. So we've been successful in this. We've raised $70 million and supplied tens of thousands of kits, but we need hundreds of thousands, unfortunately. And we're going to be doing something with Bucha and some other areas, but we'll see. We want to be very specific and very effective. And then the third area, we're trying to work on what we call Ukrainian Global University. There's a number of programming initiatives. Well, let's say we now raise funds to support those scholars who are staying in Ukraine and who are facing hardship, or those students who are staying, or maybe some students are doing transfers, and we help them with paperwork, or we participate in all kinds of initiatives to demonstrate, we have an initiative, No Discussion of Ukraine Without Ukraine, and some other initiatives. These are all intellectual, some research initiatives we are doing with the business school. We're running panels of businesses, surveying panels, and see how they're doing and trying to provide support to them. We are working on sanctions design daily. We're working on Marshall Plan recovery. So we're doing a lot of different things, trying to be helpful in many concrete ways. And that's our way to cope with the tragedy. And it's our way to demonstrate to the enemy that we are going to win.
Well, Timothy, that is so helpful. Thank you. And please consider this alliance a source of support. If you want to put your, just for now, the link to your foundation in the chat, that would be wonderful, because I think some individual participants may be interested, and we will follow up with you about all those projects and how we can support as an alliance. So now let's turn to the military conflict, and let's start with cybersecurity. So Professor Tsuchiya, let's turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the cyber warfare picture, and how are Ukrainians so successfully defending their cyber assets?
Thank you very much. So thank you for having me to this panel. So I think President Putin have misunderstood the situation. So the development of the war might not be what he expected. So talking about cyber warfare, I'm surprised at how ineffective Russia is. So 8 years ago, during the Crimea crisis in 2014, Russia was able to easily take control of cyberspace. So they were able to shut down cell phones, disable drones from flying, and disrupt with disinformation. And in 2015 and 16, they even managed to cause massive power outage in Western Ukraine through cyber attacks, even if for several hours. So this time, however, they were unable to do so. And Ukraine's electricity, telecommunications, and other infrastructures are still alive in many cities. So it's very amazing that President Milovanov is zooming, and so using Twitter from a war victim country. So it's a very big surprise. And so smartphones are used by many people in this war. So in 2014, as I said, Russia stopped the cellular network. So even they could take pictures, videos, they couldn't send. But now, after 8 years, I think Ukraine prepared enough to secure the infrastructure. So now they can send pictures, videos to the world. We are watching the Ukraine from all over the world. So cyber warfare is somehow what President Putin and the Russian government envisioned. It didn't happen. So Ukraine is doing a great job to defend its networks and cyberspace. Thank you, Annelise.
Thank you. And of course, KO has tremendous strengths in this area. So as we think about how we can support, we'll rely on you for sure. Let's turn now to the nuclear aspects of this conflict. Gail Woloshack, the International Atomic Energy Agency has been telling us that there are concerns about some of the nuclear reactors. Nuclear reactors obviously not created to be in a war zone where major fighting is happening. How worried are you about an accident? And what do you make of the news recently that Russian troops have withdrawn from Chernobyl?
Yeah, thanks, Annalise. I'm happy to be here. I'm in touch with IAEA pretty often, but I'm also in touch with the Chernobyl people quite a bit. And the biggest worry now is not so much whether the reactor is safe at Chernobyl. Zaporizhzhia is a different story where it's Russian occupied. The biggest worry in Chernobyl is what they've left behind. So the Russian soldiers apparently dug trenches in the so-called Red Forest. The Red Forest is the most contaminated soil on the planet. It was an area that turned red after Chernobyl blew in 1986, and it was bulldozed down to the ground, and the trees were buried because they were so radioactive. Now, what it's claimed, what the Russians actually have claimed, is that some of their people, some of the soldiers, were so sick that they had to go to Gomel in Belarus, which is where they had handled all the Chernobyl cases. They specialize in radiation medicine, so they're claiming that they have acute radiation sickness. I've kind of evaluated the doses. I think if they were there for 8 days straight and laying in the soil or near the soil, they could have the beginning stages of acute radiation sickness. But even if they're just there for a shorter time, they're going to have things like nausea and vomiting and decreased lymphocyte counts, which go along with radiation poisoning. The problem is going to be, what's Ukraine going to do now? They're going to have this mess that they're going to have to clean up. The soil is probably spreading all over. The winds blow it. I mean, this could be a very big problem, I think. So that I think is the biggest worry on the ground. The only other thing I'll say is that the Russians also stole a lot of radioactive sources from Chernobyl. At least it looks like that for now. And we don't know what they're doing with those or what they did with them. So there are a lot of questions.
That's very depressing. Thank you, though. Turning now to Dean Brunet. So what violations of international law and international humanitarian law are we observing, in your opinion, Jutta?
Yeah, thank you, Annalise. Let me first of all say that it seems actually utterly inadequate to measure the horrors that are being perpetrated in Ukraine against international law. And yet law, of course, matters because the egregious violations, like the ones that are being perpetrated, demand a determined response. So with that caveat, let me just say a few brief things. So I think the first thing to say is that Russia continues to violate the foundational norm of the UN Charter and the post-World War II international order, and that is the prohibition on the use of force. I don't really need to go into too much detail to suggest that I think is a fairly obvious conclusion, in the sense that the UN Charter prohibits aggressive war. The only justification for force, or the only scope for lawful force under the Charter, is to use it either with UN Security Council authorization, which is plainly not the situation here, or in self-defense. And self-defense is triggered when an armed attack against a state occurs. So Russia has offered a mixture of arguments, to the extent that it has actually provided any sort of legal justification. One argument has been that they were stopping an atrocity or genocide, but of course there's no evidence that there were Ukrainian perpetrated atrocities, let alone genocide, occurring. So it's a deeply cynical claim, and in any event, as the International Court of Justice has also pointed out in its recent interim order decision on Ukraine, the use of force isn't the way to respond to such atrocities. So that leaves potentially self-defense, but again, here very briefly, Russia has claimed to be acting in collective self-defense with Luhansk and Donetsk, the problem, very simply put, with that argument is that these are not states, so they are not entitled to the right to self-defense. So Russia cannot exercise collective self-defense in conjunction with these entities. And then there's been a kind of preemptive self-defense argument in the vein that with Ukraine potentially joining NATO, it's a threat to the existence of Russia, and so on and so on. So preemptive self-defense is not permissible under international law. You might recall the debates about the Bush Doctrine around the time of the Iraq War. This has been roundly rejected at the UN level, including, I believe, by Russia, China, the non-aligned movement, and so on. So you need an actual armed attack on a state, or at least an imminent attack. None of that was present. So the bottom line is that there is no justification. This is an egregious violation of the foundational norm. Briefly on international humanitarian law, which in some ways is perhaps even more egregious. What's happening there legally, what is occurring in Ukraine is an international armed conflict. So the Geneva Conventions apply, which means that military operations are only meant to be directed against military objectives. Deliberately targeting civilians is a war crime. There is also a principle of proportionality that operates. So what we see here is, I guess, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, so also violations on that front. And I believe there are currently UN human rights monitors in Ukraine condemning the use of explosive weapons and other indiscriminate attacks by Russian military forces on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So, and we've all seen the images on TV just in the last couple of days. So I think, again, it's fairly obvious that egregious violations are occurring all over the place.
So next we have Dominique Arel. Dominique, obviously today's audience is a global audience, largely outside of Eastern Europe. As you see it, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you're seeing in the press or in debates outside of the specialist community about this war, about Putin's motivations, and so on?
Well, I think Putin's motivations are pretty clear, so maybe I can lay them out for the global audience, because of course every war can be very, very confusing. And it's certainly confusing when one of the stated goals of the war is so-called denazification, which to the rest of the world seems bizarre and absurd. So what are the motivations? That Putin was, again, very, very clear on February 21st, when he made his speech, first recognizing the two self-proclaimed republics and then launching the war 2 days later. It's about Donbass and it's about NATO. But what about Donbass? Because officially, this is a military operation for the protection of Donbass. And as Jutta pointed out, of course, there was no genocide in Donbass, meaning in the self-proclaimed republics. And since 2015, actually, there were very few civilians who died. There were quite a bit in 2014 when the war raged in these territories. So it was a complete fabrication. But for 8 years, there was a diplomatic track called the Minsk Agreement, which actually was embedded in the Security Council, UN Security Council resolution. And the track was towards the reintegration of these territories into Ukraine, but by granting autonomy to these territories. And Ukrainians resisted that for 7 years. You had a diplomatic impasse. It's pretty clear retrospectively that what Russia wanted with this reintegration was to put Donbass in power in Kiev. And completely changed the nature of the Ukrainian regime. But for 7 years, that didn't happen. You had the diplomatic impasse. Now on NATO, perhaps the misconception here, understandably, is the fixation about the official status of Ukraine, whether it would join NATO or not join NATO. And we hear a lot about neutrality these days as some kind of a breakthrough, but that's not what really Russia and Putin is after. It's not about whether Ukraine one day would join NATO. Everybody understood for 15 years now that it's not about to happen. It's certainly not happening now, even though there was this declaration. what Russia truly wants is NATO completely out of Ukraine. What does that mean? Is but for 7 or 8 years, you had the Canadian military, the American military, Australia, Britain was there too, training the Ukrainian army. To some results, as we see, the Ukrainian army is doing amazing since the beginning of the war. So that was, even though Ukraine was not part of NATO, NATO was increasingly in Ukraine, not in terms of having military bases and developing nuclear weapons. Of course, this is all a fabrication, but training the army and then gradually sending more and more weapons. When talking here before the war, that was the threat for Putin. So when he's talking about demilitarization, it literally means, first of all, NATO was to be completely out of Ukraine, if not of Central Europe, and the Ukrainian military should be unable to defend the state by being reduced to its 50,000 soldiers, according to Russian declarations. These are the motivations of Putin. So with Donbass, when I said the Donbass people essentially kind of taking over Kiev has transformed itself since the beginning of the war is by the aim to completely eliminate the Ukrainian, not only the Ukrainian government, but the very idea that Ukrainians are distinct from Russians and therefore can take their own decisions, such as joining NATO, joining the EU, or having their own, again, sense of selfhood. So that have become the motivation of Putin. Since that couldn't be achieved to diplomacy, then let's just destroy the Ukrainian state altogether, and then we will get security, and we have the war.
That's disturbing but insightful. Thank you. So let's turn now to the Russian side of this picture. So Professor Mondras is a professor of political science in the field of Russian studies and international relations at Sciences Po in Paris, and also a research fellow at the National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, in Paris. Marie, you're an expert on Russia. What about the Russian side? Following up on what Dominique said, how are you seeing that Russian citizens are misunderstanding this conflict or this situation? And can you talk at all about the role of the media in Russia on this?
Annelise, I will answer your question, but may I build on quickly on what Dominique has said? And I also have a question for Timothy Milvanov. The first thing is, I think at this stage, after 6 weeks of war of terror, I think we are beyond, studying whatever is in Putin's mind, or we are way beyond this, and I think we should stop discussing or even showing on television the horrific fakes that Russia is putting forward. It's just, we have to stop doing that, because that's part of the subversion war, which we've all been victims of in the last 15 years. So first, let's stop this. We need to concentrate on Ukraine and also on the medium and long terms. This is where I have a question for our Ukrainian friend. You said, when the war is won. My question is, how can the war be won? And what do you expect? It seems to me, and at least, I am in Europe, and I know Ukraine very well also, and I work on European policies toward Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. And it seems to me that the immediate problem of today is how the Ukrainians are going to push back. I don't see that they can win because, and this is really my question, you understand that if we, NATO, Europeans, Americans, do not go further than providing arms, the Russian army, the Russian mercenaries, they will stay in Donbass, in Crimea, maybe, you know, in other parts between Crimea and Donbass. And then what do we do? What do we do? Then we are completely stuck because we are back in the situation of the spring of 14, but just much, much worse. So I would really like to have your, you know, your reflection on how this is being discussed in Ukraine. And my third point, very quickly, because I am European, and you know, like you, I mean, we do have Ukrainian and Russian students and scholars to deal with, and after what I've just heard about NATO, that, you know, Ukraine can never join NATO. I mean, the face of the earth is completely changing. We have no idea what might happen in 3 months or 6 months. But there's one thing I wanted to tell you, is that Ukraine will join the EU soon. I mean, it will certainly be given admission process very soon, because it was too early, and the minds of our ruling bodies in Europe were not quite yet with it. We denied the success sometime, you know, early March, but we will. Now there's absolutely, I think it's almost sure that we understand we can't leave Ukraine lost, occupied in part, completely destroyed, and lost in a sort of gray zone. Neutrality is totally impossible given the nature of the dictatorship. So one big uncertainty, of course, is whether the Putin dictatorship will fall or not. Now, because I've already spoken too long, on your question about what's going on inside Russia, if I may just refer to the long article I just published today in Le Monde, which is being translated in English, so I'll be happy to share it with everybody, which is really how the insane war is already fracturing the Russian dictatorship. And so just my advice is first to really look at the facts, stop listening to Russian media and to fake news coming from Russia. There cannot be any support for a war that is not happening, because the Russian who is a hostage of the television has to believe that it is a special operation, and it's not given the possibility of thinking otherwise. So he cannot have an opinion about what the army is doing, because he's not supposed to know what atrocities the army is doing. But he is already a feeling, you know, I mean, living the hardships of a country at war, because in fact, Russia and the Russians are at war. And this is where I believe we should be acting. And there I'll be also very interested to have our Japanese colleagues point on this. Since almost, you know, 80% of the Russian army is concentrated in this crazy war, should not we build some kind of scare, you know, next to other regions of Russia? Because, you know, this regime in Moscow, the only thing they will understand is force and fear. And so I wonder if that's not also one of the other instruments that we have at hand to try and make the Ukrainians be in a position of force.
Timothy, do you want to respond to that question? Can you hear us?
Yes, I'll try. Yes, thank you. I agree with the point that we should look at the facts now and stop guessing what's in Putin's mind. I also think it's true that unfortunately for all of us, the leadership in Russia understands force, not the diplomatic argument. I also think that the way this is all going to develop is it's just not about Ukraine anymore. That many more Buchas and Mariupols will show up, and we will see many more atrocities that will be difficult for us to believe. And it's going to challenge just the way we think about the world, or at least Europe. And we also will come to realize it's not a 1 or 2 or 5 individuals in Russia. It's not Putin and his close advisors. There's something fundamentally wrong with the way that society currently, or not all of them, of course, obviously, but a substantive part of the society is willing to view the rest of the world. Then we also will come to realize that it is all coupled with nuclear weapons in complete disregard for any kind of nuclear security. It is coupled with at least 3 fundamental economic weapons. And at least one of them has been used politically. So the first one is energy. The second one is logistics from China to Europe. So the Central European hub from the Baltics to the Black Sea are critical for at least North China logistics to Europe and back. And then the third one is food security that people are not talking about, because Russia, through disrupting food security in the region, in particular through taking Ukraine out of the map on exports, if it disrupts planting seasons and blocks the ports, it will be able to destabilize or continue to put pressure to destabilization of Northern Africa, Middle East, and some of the Asian countries. And so we're living in a different world where, it's just not Ukraine anymore. It could have been Ukraine had Russia taken Kiev quickly. Then it would have been some kind of, what do we do next episode. But at this point, it's we will just end up sending more heavy weapons to Ukraine, maybe closing the sky in some form at some point, imposing an embargo on gas at some point, a little bit later. And that will trigger all kinds of economic issues in Europe, and political too. We see Hungary, and Hungary is following the pattern of Russia. And I mean by, the public being okay with a person, with someone, doesn't matter what the names are, being, continuously re-elected for many terms in the office with some rhetoric, which is very, very nationalist and very anti-human. And we have other issues. So, I think it's challenging the way we think about democracy in Europe rather than Ukraine. And Ukraine is currently at forefront and will have to be at the forefront. So the end game to this is actually implode. The Russian regime has to implode, and it should be a new security framework, which looks not only at the military aspect of it, but also at the humanity aspect of it. What went wrong? Again, a century later or 80 years later, that it becomes a norm to not admit and to be in denial and at the same time support the war for the majority of people in a country. So this is a challenge to all of us, and Ukraine is just one of the fighters in this game. Unfortunately for Ukrainians, for us, we're at the forefront, but I think we're all in it together, whether people want to think about it that way or not.
So that's really important. And I think that deserves a lot more discussion over the weeks ahead about what this actually means. Magdalena, I want to ask you then, just following up on what Timofey said about the relationship between the mobility between across the Russia-Ukraine border traditionally, and the fact that so many people have relatives on both sides of this border. So given the kind of dramatic shift that Timofey is talking about, and indeed that Marie is gesturing towards a necessity for. What do you see as the impact on the cultural identities of those who are sort of caught in the border spaces? If you like.
Yes, thank you. There's no doubt that the scale of brutality of the war will have a major effect on future mutual hostility between Ukrainians and Russians. I just want to mention one thing that is important to notice, that within Ukraine, political identities have already been changing since 2014. So they were crystallizing around Ukraine and Ukraine's sovereignty. So that also explains, among other things, the resistance and determination of the Ukrainian people to fight. For example, just to give some examples, in 2020, opinion polls in the government-controlled areas of Donbas, they show that in this traditionally Russophone and Russophile region, citizens were critical of Russia, supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, and were less and less inclined to claim an autonomous status for Donbas within Ukraine. So political identities since 2014 are less divided than before, already in 2014. So that does not mean, of course, that people's Russian identity attributes and identifications are erased. The same polls in 2020 show, for example, that people in Donbas still want to have some guarantees concerning the use of their language, the Russian. So it is probably, we can expect that during the war and in the aftermath of the war, we will probably see Russian speakers in eastern parts of Ukraine try to avoid speaking Russian, to blend in better, to fit. But their long-term interests should not be ignored, especially that they are Ukrainian citizens and that they feel as such. And these people, as you mentioned, they have families on both sides of the border. And that also should not be ignored, because these family ties may represent actually the best way to try to reestablish relations between Russians and Ukrainians after the war. Otherwise, these relations will have a very hard time to overcome the trauma and of the war and the aggression. And just maybe to think about the cross-border relations between Ukrainian and Russians. Well, I was working at some point at trust building measures, and it is important to say that this is not a civil war. So we are not talking about measures in divided societies. We should distinguish trust building measures between Russia and Ukraine from trust building within Ukraine after war. And this is about cohesion, social cohesion that will legitimize any institutional designs or geopolitical orientations that Ukraine will pursue. So from what I see is that between Ukrainians and Russians from Russia, at the political level, as long as Putin is in power in Kremlin, trust building efforts seem impossible. Not after Mariupol, not after Bucha. And what happened in Bucha also questions the sole responsibility of Putin. So there's Russian soldiers, individuals that committed these crimes. This puts the blame on more than one decision maker and renders the process of trust building that much more difficult. So at the society level, family ties will be very important. Local NGOs can make some projects, initiatives, cross-border, etc. But within Ukraine, much will depend also, and this goes back to Marie's comment, which outcome we will have after the war. So what do we mean by these eastern border and Ukrainians? The opinion polls we refer to do not include Ukrainian citizens living in Crimea, in self-proclaimed republics. And there the pro-Russian attitudes are stronger, especially given that 1.5 million people were displaced, internally displaced from these regions after 2014. So it is the political identity changes. I think it's important to know they already were changing since 2014, and the cohesion inside Ukraine is more than ever. So this is good, but again, what will be the outcome of the war, and which territories will be in, out, frozen conflict will pursue, but that will be a very, very hard long-term generation will be have to enter the process of this trust building reconciliation. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Timothy, you have your hand up. Did you want to comment
Yeah,
on this?
I want to maybe kind of either ask a question or maybe make a comment and challenge some of this. So, you know, I'm a Russian speaker. My native language is Russian, and I've been speaking Ukrainian and Russian and English in Ukraine during the war. And I have been challenged only once on the fact that I'm speaking Russian by a person from Mariupol, by a refugee, by a person who switched to Ukrainian. And she was challenging me. She lost her husband, or her husband was severely traumatized, and she challenged me that I'm not speaking, you know, that I'm speaking Russian, and you know, and her Ukraine, you know, she switched herself, and her Ukraine is not very good, and she was, you know, in trauma. What I'm trying to say is that I'm a bit confused why we're still having a discussion about language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, half of the government I'm speaking to daily is speaking Russian. Yeah, we you know, we speak Ukrainian for reason, but it's not, you know, like an investor in Ukraine, no one has ever said a word to me for speaking Russian now. I think if we, you know, I think this actually imposed by Russia narrative. They're trying to capture that Russian is somehow pro-Russia and Ukrainian, it's Ukraine. No, Russian language belongs to Ukraine as much as to Russia. We're Kiev, Rus, you know. This is where the Russian language is coming from. And there are many more people in the world who speak Russian. Russia doesn't have, you know, it's not the identity. Russian language is not the identity. I think the identity is something different. It's whether it's imperialistic or, you know, whether it's a feeling that you can use force for achieving your objectives. Or whether, you know, look at Ukraine. Ukraine has been essentially defending and Ukrainian identity is about freedom and about challenging its government. I think that's the major difference, whether how much of the central authority you obey or not. I think that's the real difference between the Ukrainian identity and the Russian identity, where even now Zelensky is being criticized domestically by people, you know, because they could challenge the authority all the time. So I think it's just language has nothing to do, in my view, and it's really a false narrative. So that's one of the points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I just can jump in, I absolutely agree, and I cannot disagree with you. You're living this and not me. But these are exactly border identities, which are hybrid by definition. So you have language used at home and ethnic self-declarations and political loyalties. They do not necessarily align and not one, and they can be activated differently.
Thank you. Thank you.
Different situations.
Yes. Absolutely. Okay, we have a bunch of questions, but we have one more speaker. And so I want to give the floor now to Tomas, who's a political scientist and an expert in deterrence. Tomas, I want to ask you about what kind of deterrence or embargoes you think is most effective here, but also I want to give you an opportunity, if you wish, to comment on this very interesting exchange we had between Marie and Timothy about the geopolitical future of the region and whether or not this conflict can be won without greater intervention and what this means for the future of Europe and the region more generally.
So first of all, thank you, Annelies, to give me the occasion to intervene. So I'm a more generalist of, let us say, the causes of war and war prevention. And so I will take some, let us say, historical experiences in order to situate the Ukrainian case, and maybe start with the first question. So what is the effectiveness of deterrence for, let us say, war prevention? So now all depends how you define deterrence. Let us include economic deterrence and even, let us say, symbolic deterrence, so the threat to be excluded from international community. So of course, there was no military threat from the start. This was kind of, can consider it as a problem, but it's also quite risky. And then you have the other two methods taken by the Biden administration, Europeans, so the economic sanctions, so the Gazoduct, of course, and others, the SWIFT now, and the symbolic sanctions, Russia's exclusion basically from the international community as a pariah state, to quote Trust. So why this policy failed? This is quite clear. What happened? Of course, you can say, you can consider that war was already decided long before. I'm a bit skeptical, but why did it fail, and how would we explain in IR, so international relations theory, this failure? So the first thing that strikes me is that the threats were, let us say, formulated in public. There was no confidential threat, and we all know that if threats are articulated in a public manner in front of TV and others, it is quite difficult for the target state, so for Russian leaders, to, let us say, to make concessions, because it contradicts the very idea of sovereign leaders, and we all know that the Putin administration likes to display, let us say, strengths, kind of virility. So this is the first reason for me why it failed. And then it also failed because there was no, I would say, safe-facing measure. If you want to have, let us say, if you take the Cuban Missile Crisis as a comparison, so you can consider, of course, Khrushchev put out of his missiles, and finally, so it was a victory of American, but it is much more complicated in the sense that there were important concessions from Kennedy, recognition of Cuba's territorial integrity. There was a withdrawal from the Jupiter missiles, and nothing in exchange has been offered to Russia. So you cannot, so the problem was, in my opinion, that once you move with 100,000 soldiers and even more to the border, it is difficult, let us say, just to withdraw with nothing. And so now we continue with economic sanctions, symbolic sanctions, and nobody asks what is the effect. So we expect that there will be, let us say, a defeat in some aspects, but the first effect is that Russian people also were suffering. Let us not forget the Iraqi sanctions. More than 500,000 people died during the American sanctions against Iraq. This is not even discussed, how Russians will react. So we have also to think how to earn, let us say, Russians' hearts and minds. And we should not underestimate the Putin's government's ability to control the national narrative. And maybe what we do confirms exactly that we are hostile, that Russia is leagued, and other people than Putin consider that the NATO enlargement, that NATO is now with 30 members, that former Soviet states are now member of the NATO, is a threat, even Gorbachev. So we have also to think big, not only about Putin, I agree with it, not only Putin's mind, but Russian people's mind. I do not believe that there is a kind of, so historically speaking, if you compare it with the Iran experience or with the Cuban experience, we cannot imagine reasonably that people will topple the government because they have no more, let us say, the same economic comfort than before.
That's interesting. Well, actually, just on that point, we have a question from one of the U7 Plus Alliance student leaders. Shivona Fernandez-Kohler from Bocconi University. And the question actually is to you, Magdalena. She says, really kind of, I think along the lines of what Tomas is saying, that one can be positive about what might happen in Russia, but very often crises like this lead to increased nationalism, rallying around the strong leader. And what evidence is there, if any, that these sanctions and this public distrust, sort of the public shaming that Russia is experiencing and so on, will actually lead to a change in the hearts and minds of Russian people?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that because I'm not a Russia specialist, but absolutely could go this way or this way. But we were talking about the information, and certainly the kind of information that the Russian people receive, read, etc., will have an impact on the way they will rally around the flag, or will be a backlash. But I think what Marie sent us talked about what's happening in Russia that was published in Le Monde would answer better that question than I can do today. So maybe Marie can jump in.
Would you like to comment?
Yes, sure. And there's also another question addressed to me about the EU and Ukraine. I think it's good to start from what Magdalena and Timothy were saying. From the very start, Russian speakers have been a slogan and an instrument of spoiling and war by the Putin leadership, very clearly. They've been this narrative already, you remember earlier, when the Baltic states joined the EU and NATO. Remember that outcry about Russian speakers who, were close to a genocide, or later in 2008, the South Ossetians, maybe 20,000 people, were being threatened by Tbilisi of a genocide. So what's been happening is that we in the West have lived not only with the narrative, but with the very vocabulary and syntax. And for some reason I don't understand, because I've been fighting against this for years and years, and I'm not the only one, that has stuck in the heads of a majority of our political and economic elites. To this day, you can hear people saying that you have Russian speakers in Donbass who don't like Kiev and love Putin. This is totally ridiculous. First, the country is totally bilingual, and those people in Donbass have been forced to go with the narrative and forced to give away their Ukrainian passports and get Russian passports. This is the way you wage war. So now we're back to the question of partition of Ukraine, and I'm turning to Timothy again. I know this is very painful, but clearly, because the Russian army is actually being defeated, it has been defeated for 6 weeks, because if the goal was grandiose, now the goal is absolutely ridiculous, because it is just going back to what the Russian mercenaries were already having at the end of 2014, just getting a little bit more of territory, maybe ruined Mariupol on top. They won't get Kharkiv, I don't think so. So what a defeat that is. So my question is very straightforward. Do you think, Timothy, that President Zelensky is ready to go for a partition of Ukraine, where you actually prefer to deal with a very unfair petition under duress, but which means that can be renegotiated, because it's been negotiated with the gun on your head, which then can be, and so that a larger Donbass and Crimea, and then answering quickly the question about the
Sorry,
EU.
Marie, I'm sorry,
Then,
we have to
yes.
stop.
And then I think about the EU. What I was saying is that we have to open the path. Of course, it's not going to happen just in a few months. So let's not be legalistic. The world has changed dramatically in Europe as well. So let's not be legalistic. Let's be very pragmatic and know that once the dictatorship falls in Moscow, then better things can be negotiated.
Thank you. Okay, so Timothy, we are 2 minutes over time, and I recognize that many people have to leave, but I want to give you the last word to answer this question from Marie about partition, but also to give you a chance to say to this audience of university leaders from around the world, what support Ukrainian universities need from universities in conclusion, and then we'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, to the question about partition, I think what Putin failed to understand is that Ukrainian president is Ukrainian president. Zelensky or Poroshenko or the previous presidents are truly constrained by what people of Ukraine want. And the question is, what will people of Ukraine accept? Will people of Ukraine accept the partition? Probably not. That doesn't mean, there could be all kinds of negotiations about Crimea, but in terms of Mariupol, in terms of south of Ukraine, I think whoever is going to be the president who signs some kind of partition, they will not last long in Ukraine. So that's my understanding. And we also have seen that in Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 that both Poroshenko and Zelensky have resisted instilling of Donbass into the political system of Ukraine just because they would have been out of power immediately, plus they have their own views. So that's a short answer. And I think I agree here with Marie about the longer perspective. In terms of how to help academics or universities in Ukraine, engage in projects with them. Think outside, I call on everyone, think on outside of just offering a position. Found a stipend, just pick, for $5,000, you can feed a, top-notch academic in Ukraine, And so if each, 20 people donate $200, that's enough to maintain a family of an academic in Ukraine. KC or UGU or Kyiv Mogila or any other institution will facilitate that in Moldova. Set up a joint research project, order a survey, do something, collect data, have a special issue, in a journal, have a conference. They just support intellectual sovereignty and support academia, build joint projects. Don't approach it as if there is some fail in academia and they really need some charity to be saved. Yeah, of course they need money, but they need much more. They need projects, and let's do it together. So thank you.
Fantastic, great. Well, that's something we can do. So to be continued, I just want to thank Timothy in particular for joining us under these difficult conditions, and all of these esteemed panelists for your time. I know this is a large commitment, and I just appreciate the joint spirit of solidarity. So thank you, and let's continue this conversation for the U7+. Thank you. Bye.